Thank you, Alex. It's amazing to be at Midtown Scholar. I've sat in these chairs many times and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great to be here and great to be talking about this book in particular, Adrienne. Such a pleasure. I thought we could start with maybe a kind of a big picture question and take it from there. So one of the really lovely things about this book is how it weaves together your work in poetry and in food writing. So these two different genres that have intermingled and complemented each other. And so I wondered if you wanted to take this opportunity to step back a second and just talk about those two genres as they've changed over the course of that time, and maybe how you've changed in your thoughts about them and how you feel readers have changed in their thoughts about them. You write in one example how early in your career you thought about writing fiction and were experimenting with different genres, but it wasn't clear to me if you thought about like food writer as a thing in the way that other writing might be. So I think a lot has changed in both poetry and food writing, and I wanted your like insider expert thoughts about that, bird's eye view.
Well, thank you for calling me an expert. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I have been thinking about this for really all of my adult life because I've been interested in both food and poetry for all this time. And I did think food writer, but I think food writer when I began, and I'd say I would kind of mark the beginning of my interest in food probably around like 1989, 1990. I began thinking that food writer meant editor or writer for a food magazine. Food writers write for Gourmet, or they write cookbooks, they review restaurants. I think it's different now. I think writing about food has a respectability it didn't always have. It's less gendered now. I think everyone's interested in it. And instructions are available. I know so many people of like Gen Z who've learned to cook from YouTube, right? And so I think it used to be that you had to glean the cookbook. But there was a spell when I thought, this poet thing isn't working. Like, it's just too hard. The publications are obscure. Nobody sees them. I better do something that people read. I better become a food writer. But then when I tried that, it turned out that it was full of people who were saying, like, this is too hard. I need to do something that pays. I mean, it's another thing that people do for the love of it. But I think what's happened now is that poetry has benefited from its brevity in that a lot of people read poems, even though it's still very hard to sell a book of poems. People don't have a problem pulling up a poem on a device and reading it. I think that's been a fabulous thing for poetry. So the fact that recipes are out there and poems are out there and they all seem like they're free, I mean, I guess they are, but I keep wanting to get past that stuff that's available freely. It all is kind of a doorway into something that you will probably want to get in print. I've probably veered way off your question.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's shown that both of these genres are so deeply necessary that they almost become like, in some ways taken for granted, or they're not taken for granted, but just like circulated in ways that might not be ways of circulation other genres enjoy.
Right. And I mean, I've heard people say, why would you buy a cookbook when there are so many recipes just available already? Oh,
goodness. They need to talk to the two of us and, yeah, keep going.
Like people who can't stop buying poetry books and cookbooks.
Yeah, who love both, yeah.
But one thing, and I think there's something about this in this collection. I remember there was a spell in my life when I was always moving. Many people, I think, have had that experience. And the question was, do I buy a book, or do I just try to get it from the library and borrow it from somebody because I'm going to have to move soon? And so that question would hover over every bookstore adventure. But what my friends and I realized was the two genres you should always buy are poetry and cookbooks, because you never finish them, right? And they change. And you discover, I'm sure you have this experience, you open a cookbook that you've had for 20 years and you find a recipe you've never noticed.
Absolutely. I love that. You're never finished, and you can start anywhere in many ways. Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into the next question I wanted to ask. So maybe I'll go there, and then we can pause and read a little. I know that everyone here wants to hear from this book. Well, my next question was a question this is kind of like the time when I risk a little bit of a theory. In reading this book, my theory was there was a stealth theme in this book, Adrienne, and that theme was about time. And I was thinking about time because of the kind of sweep of the pieces in this, but also thinking about how the book really meditated in somewhat hidden ways, somewhat more overt ways, about the way in which cooking, writing about food, and writing poems all kind of fight with each other for time. That's on the one side, but then also complement each other in their temporal moves in certain ways. And I was thinking about, for you, how the time of cooking and the time of poetry might relate. Cooking is famously something that always has to be done again and again and again. The whole didn't I feed you yesterday problem. But poetry is something that endures. It's famously about timelessness and immortality, right? Not marble and the gilded monuments. So they're very, very different, these two modes of creativity, and they also kind of ask us to inhabit time in different ways. Writing, you can't really predict when it will be done. A cake, it's going to be done after 30 to 35 minutes. I wonder if that rings true to you, that my theory about time, and how that has affected your career as you make it through these pieces.
I was floored by this observation you made, because I hadn't thought about it that way. I felt that in gathering these pieces were written over some 30 years. And so I picked what I thought were the strongest, or not necessarily just strength, but did I start somewhere and then find myself somewhere else in the process? I think that's when a piece is most alive. So that's how I decided which ones belonged in here and which ones could just kind of be quietly forgotten. So yes, there is an obsession with time, and there is this complementary relationship to time that cooking and writing have. That writing, you hope, is for posterity, right? And you know that a lot of what you write, no matter how much experience you have, shouldn't right, stick around. But you're playing the long game, and you want something to outlast you. And cooking, of course, is the reverse. You cook it, and then you or someone else or both eat it, right? And then it's gone. Is that still art? I think yes. I think we've, especially now that we can take photos so easily. I think many of us take photos of the meals we're really pleased with, right, after we've made them. So why? Why do I myself spend so much time cooking when it doesn't have to take that long? There are lots of shortcuts these days, but I keep on doing it. In fact, I did it for tonight. The snacks that will follow the reading, I cooked. And as the time to come over here today was approaching and I was still cooking, I was thinking, I think this is harder than writing. There's something about writing that is a little flexible, that you can be walking a dog and thinking about writing, and something in your process will occur. But if you're cooking, you're walking the dog, that onion still isn't chopped when you get back, right? It's hopelessly linear. So yeah, there's a tension, and yet my fascination, or maybe the thing that drives me to write about food so much, is that I don't understand why I keep spending so much time on the cooking when it seems that writing is the thing that's got a better chance of lasting.
Yeah, I find this question fascinating, and maybe this is a good place to just pause and hear a little bit of the writing about cooking, which is kind of combining the best of both, like capturing that transience and dailiness, and also putting it into words that last, which is, to me, part of the wonderful magic of what food writing can be about. So, yeah, do you want to read a little bit about from one of these essays?
Yeah, I've got a couple of pieces that talk a little bit about writing and food. Maybe I'll read the beginning of The Two Kinds of Poets, which, if you have the book, is on page 146, but you don't really need the book, I hope. So this is maybe more about eating, but eating is often about cooking. I have an informal, untested theory that when it comes to sustenance while writing, there are two kinds of poets: coffee poets and food poets. Coffee poets, who in some cases could be considered tea poets, can go half the day or longer without solid food. Their focus is sustainable without the distraction and mess of eating. Coffee poets, who are also capable of writing in public spaces, are doubly blessed, as they can log many hours in a cafe without having to incur the expensive meals with their beverages or the interruption of leaving for lunch. Bringing a thermos, they can bide their time in libraries, getting lost in the books they're reading and writing, enjoying a communal version of a solitary activity. As a food poet, one whose energy levels are better maintained by 6 small meals a day versus 3 large, I envy coffee poets their long stretches of concentration. They aren't constantly reminded by hunger of their profane alimentary existence as human animals. When they write at home, their kitchen sinks don't fill with dishes within the first 3 hours. Their keyboards don't get sticky or greasy. They don't end a day of writing only to realize that, bit by bit, they have eaten all of last night's leftovers, and there is nothing for dinner.
Yeah, that last paragraph, I was like, yes, 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 yes.
Are you a food poet?
I'm a food something.
So,
I want to ask a little bit. I'd love to hear reading a bit more from the shopping cart, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about another, I found really generative theme in this book, and this one's a little less kind of, my own out there theory, but you write at several points about your own family's history and the way that food was woven through that history. And in particular, the way that you remember the place that you grew up and the time that you grew up. And it was a really interesting and very particular place and time, Atlanta in the US South, really before the height or the increase in immigration that happened in the later 70s, 80s, 90s, and onward. So it was before a place like Beaufort Highway was what it is now. And you write about how, there weren't just restaurants with cuisines from all over the world. It wasn't that way at all. And how wonderful it is to go back there now and see the changes that come with immigration and migration and all sorts of demographic shifts, economic shifts. But also, I think you write with nostalgia about that time when you were growing up, when the food culture of where you were was not as easy as it might have been later. And I wonder if you wanted just to reflect on that a little bit. I'm very curious about what your own very wonderfully precise memories of that time might suggest to us about how we write about food and how we do food history and how we think about food and immigration and food and culture and family. And it just seems to me very specific and fine-grained and subtle what you're doing with that. So I wonder if you could just describe that a little bit more and tell us more about that.
Well, thank you. I mean, you just described it beautifully. I think the question of nostalgia is a complicated one, and it was maybe my ambivalence about nostalgia that drove me to write the poems in Peach State, the book of poems that precedes this book. And that book is all about Atlanta and the Atlanta I grew up in and the Atlanta that is now, which is, of course, an international food fest every day if you want it to be. Why, indeed, do I feel a sense of loss about the way things used to be, even though they're better now?
Well, yeah, what's the better is the question, right? And
yeah.
What's lost and what's gained, yeah.
And I wondered, I mean, there have been times when I have met, say, other Asian Americans who also grew up being the only one, right? Like most of the time you were in a room, you were the only Asian person, and it's a different reality. And I think there's something about not being the only one anymore that isn't bad. It's actually great, but it's novel. So it's a little bit hard to comprehend. It's a little bit hard to remember. I would sometimes, once I got to places that had more of an Asian population, I would look around and say, like, what are these Asian people doing here? Like, I just wouldn't even realize that I registered as one of them. So it's not so much nostalgia as fascination, maybe, for the relationship we have to the place that makes us. And I think this has been a theme in literature forever, that most writers who have come from say, a small town, inevitably they go to the big city. But what do? They write about the small town they came from. And for some reason, you can't not love the place, even if you fled it for whatever reason.
Yeah. And certain things that were like substitutions or compromises to make the dishes that your family needed to make then become their own forms of, I don't know what the word would be, part of that tradition, part of what you need to make, right? And you chronicle that process too. It's a really fascinating and I think kind of undervalued phenomenon or moment in our food culture. Would you like to read a little bit from the shopping cart in the Chinese restaurant?
Oh, yes. Okay.
Or from another piece?
I'll read from that one. So this piece was written, and this is the piece that appeared in an anthology on eating ethically. So I was exploring why, when I'm at home in Carlisle, I'm always buying sustainable this, grass-fed that. But then if you put me in a Chinese restaurant with my extended family in Atlanta, I don't care, right? Like everything it's magical thinking, right? So the excerpt I'll read doesn't get into that. It just describes the meal. So let's see. And I'll just add that when you're in a large group, there's no individual ordering in a Chinese family restaurant meal. The ritual goes like this. There may be small plates to start, such as smoked fish or fried peanuts, but there might not be. Soup can be first or last or both, brought out in a large bowl. The server arranges a line of individual bowls along the edge of the Lazy Susan, ladles hot soup into each small bowl, and lets each diner claim one. Any remaining soup in the serving bowl stays, and it's good etiquette to press it on others until the chorus of refusals is settled by one or two people who, after a demurral or two, relent. Noodles and steamed fish tend to arrive late in the procession. In the middle can be almost anything: stir fries of meat and vegetables, bubbling sandpot casseroles featuring tofu or shellfish or both, crisp salt and pepper squid adorned with hot chilies, a bright green heap of spinach flash cooked with smashed garlic. When the Lazy Susan gets crowded, someone must be persuaded to take the last prawn so that that serving dish can be removed. The middle-aged press the prawn on their elders, and the elders press it on their grandchildren. Since Chinese meals expand to include more people by increasing the variety of dishes rather than the size of each dish, large gatherings see an acceleration. The first dish often arrives by itself, the next two together, and then, in a rush of movement, often with multiple servers, 3 or 4 show up simultaneously, creating happy chaos in the center of the table and rewarding all who have had the restraint not to overload on the first few.
It's just great. I thought maybe, and this can,
How are we doing?
this is, we have time. I know there's going to be lots of Q&A too, so I'll make sure to leave time. But I didn't warn you about this, but I thought maybe I would try a little bit of service journalism here and ask, well, it's a question and then some service journalism. But the question is, so you write so wonderfully and evocatively about places, and I wonder if you have a sense about how, kind of again, bigger picture, Central PA has changed your own cooking and what you feel about how the place you are now is influencing both your cooking and then your food writing and how you're thinking about food. And then here's the service part. If you want to say like some of your favorite places in Central PA to shop or eat, or some of the resources that you find particularly nourishing in all senses. Yeah.
Great surprise question. Yeah.
But feel free to pass. I mean, and this is just, I'm just wondering, because the place is part of the weave here, really, really deep in.
It's interesting. One of the things that's made it a little harder to write about Central PA is that I haven't left. Yeah. You know, there's something about leaving a place that makes you see it.
Yeah.
And so, will I move one day and then all of a sudden want to write about Central PA all the time? But I have lived here a very long time now, and one of the ways in which it has changed my cooking is that I feel like I'm kind of eating the land at this point, because there's so many fantastic sources of food grown right here. I think I started out with the CSAs, Spiral Path, and then the Dickinson Farm CSA once it started up. So I do feel like I'm probably like 25% Dickinson produce, right? So there's just been this farm to table thing I take for granted. Yeah. And maybe it's also I complain all the time that we don't have as many restaurants as city people get, but that causes me to cook when I might otherwise have just gotten lazy and ordered something. So there's been, I think, also a tendency, I can't resist, and this is probably because in part because I am the child of immigrants. If somebody offers, a quarter of an animal, like, it's hard not to buy in bulk, right? And then all of a sudden, not only are you eating from the land around here, but it's kind of like, I just ate the leg of that animal, and tomorrow I'm going to eat the ribs. Like, it's like of the same animal. There is this feeling of connectedness, even though I spend most of my time dealing with books and paper and words. Although one could argue about that I probably spend just as much time in the kitchen, and that's why I found myself writing about food so much. So one of my sources would be, of course, the Carlisle Farmers Market, like close to home. Sharon O'Brien, weekly volunteer and farmers market person. I mean, there's a term for what you are to the farmers market. Like, you're part of it, right? Cheerleader. So that's been great. And what else? Like, what else I mean, it's odd. I'm picking like the closest to home things, even though I like Wegmans, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I can completely empathize with everything you're saying, and I think it's going to be interesting to, later on looking back on this era, this time and place, and thinking about what it does mean and how it does kind of fit in, both to your own personal story and then to the larger story of how we understand kind of where U.S. food is going, if there is such a thing, in such a broad category, and where food writing is going. Do you think, and this will be my last question, and then we can, of course, open it up, and it might sound cliched, but has the pandemic and the kind of changes in food that experience, I mean, COVID-19 is not over, certainly, but the lockdown provisions mostly are. And do you think that experience has altered, how do you think that experience has altered our relationship to cooking and food writing more generally in the U.S.?
I think we don't take for granted that we can go buy things anytime we want anymore. And I think all of us acquired more cooking skills. People who never cooked learned how, and I think that's a good thing for all of us, just in terms of our health and having self-sufficiency. How else has it changed it? I mean, we got out of the habit of having meals together, right? And that was really hard. But I don't know, is it back? I'm not actually sure. The cookbook, the sort of endless expansion of cookbook publishing, which doesn't really make sense given that I hear so many people saying I don't use cookbooks. I think people just like to read them, not necessarily cook from them. So maybe there's just a greater mental space we all have for it, and it's respected as a form of creation.
Yeah. Well, with that, a form of creation, thank you so much, Adrienne, for this
thank you, Siobhan.
book and for all of your thoughts this evening. And let's hear some Q&A. I mean, I know there's lots of
yes. Oh, and
excellent...
I have a gift for the first person to ask a question. So one of there's going to be like a hot snack over there and a salty one, etc. So I made a batch of homemade chili crisps. So the first question asker gets the jar. John.
Oh, I saw that.
Okay, it's yours.
This is just already like the best reading ever.
Adrienne, I'm the daughter of a master baker and cook, from whom I learned so much. And my daughter still cooks with memories of my mother. So this is a multi-generational thing. I love food and I love cooking. And so it wasn't easy. It wasn't hard to fall in love with Peach State, which I think is an absolute gem of a book. I've given it to so many people as gifts. And I bought this as soon as it became available for pre-order and started reading it. And one of your essays ends with this wonderful line where you say, I write not to seem virtuous or wise, but to be believed. And my question is, what do you want the reader to believe about you, about poetry, and about cooking?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I after I wrote that essay, I didn't take the next step to ask that question. What do I want people to believe? What I don't want people to believe is that the poems are the literal truth, because sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, right? And I think anybody who reads poetry habitually already knows that. But I want to be believed in that I want it to seem true. I want it, and I didn't get into the word authentic here.
I've been trying to avoid that word all night, too.
so abused in the world
It's sort of
food.
impossible.
Right.
In both poetry and in food. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But I do think that I want in my work a form of authenticity that is not the way we use it when talking about food, but the way we use it when talking about credibility. That I think one of the hardest things about writing is that if you're doing it just to have written something, it often doesn't have any life in it. But if it seems like you had a stake in it, you needed to write this thing, that's the authenticity that I mean. And so to be believed, I think, is to somehow demonstrate the necessity that I didn't waste the reader's time, whether it's a poem or an essay. And then when it comes to cooking, I mean, I've really started to think about writing recipes more, and I want those to be believed in the same way, that I want them to be dependable, and I want them to be usable and real, but never authentic in the way we might hear, like, is your roast duck an authentic Chinese roast duck? I have no idea. It's authentic to me, right? If I roasted ducks more than once every 3 years. Yeah. Wyatt.
I have 2 things. One is lots of people are. Oh, that's okay. Lots of people are watching cooking shows now as well, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on like how that's similar but also different to just reading cookbooks. And then I also want to know if you've read the short story Fish Cheeks by Amy Tan.
I don't know if I have. I mean, maybe I have, but forgot.
I read it a long time ago. It's about a Chinese family, and there's like the boyfriend of this girl is visiting and is being exposed to this big like Chinese dinner, and they're having like fish eyes and lots of like gross things, and it's all about like the culture surrounding their dinner table and how it's really different.
Oh. So how is it different watching cooking shows and reading cookbooks? Yeah, and I don't watch a lot of cooking shows because I don't watch a lot of. There's something about reading that satisfies my brain a little better. I think it's because I get to imagine a lot of it, whereas when I'm watching a show, it's kind of showing me what to see and hear. Whereas the print book forces me to visualize it, and I feel like I'm being more active. But that doesn't mean I don't like a cooking show, and I love having there was a spell during COVID, actually, that the Great British Baking Show was always on, right? And, but it moves so fast. You can't even eat dinner and watch that show at the same time because you look down at your plate so that, you know, you can get the next bite, and you've missed something gorgeous. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's lots of instructional video out there. And do you remember when TV just came and went? Like you were watching a cooking show, and then it was over, and you failed to write down some of the steps, and you were lost, right? But now you kind of know it's there, and you can go back to it any time, and as a result, we don't do anything with it. And I found that I just take for granted, well, it's all there, so I don't need to do anything. And then I forget, and it doesn't have, we have too much of a good thing, maybe. But yeah, I don't really know what the fascination is. Why would you watch someone cook?
One of the differences, too, between watching or gaining instruction from video or YouTube or TV, and then gaining instruction from a book is that if you're using a book, you can write down what you did before. So you can see, oh, I made this a year ago. What was I thinking a year ago? Like, I have all these notations that seem totally, wacky. Oh, actually, those made sense. There's kind of revisiting yourself in using cookbooks that I don't know how that would happen if you were just using video.
That's true. And you can't, it's hard to make a note for yourself.
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. People who are more adept at video than I am, or know more about YouTube and your account there. I don't know. But yeah, I love that thought about the kind of active imagination, which is kind of, I think, partly why your food writing is so wonderful. Yeah, I think that's even true with the trend toward lavish full color photos in cookbooks now, which I have theories about. So I agree. I think that's really interesting.
Any other questions? Yes.
Mark.
I'm wondering if you have a dream meal that you've yet to prepare, and if so, if you're willing to tell us what it is and for whom it might be.
The dream meal is probably your paella. Right? I don't even attempt paella because I just think Mark has just
Once you've
hit it
eaten
out of
that,
the park
yeah.
for everyone. So I don't have such a meal. I think but I do have. I'm going to answer you in a way that isn't fair. The dream poem. I would like one day to have a reason to write a crown of sonnets, because I love form and I love the sonnet, but I have not found anything that I have enough to say about to support 15 sonnets. I know that wasn't the question you asked, but I think that's kind of the dream, and they're all connected for me, and so maybe a crown of sonnets is like the Italian feast of the seven fishes, where you kind of have this order, but I'm trying to think of whether there's something that I've always wanted to make, but I think I usually try it if I want to do it. Yeah, but thanks for that question. I love how imaginative that was.
So I just love it that you're turning to recipe writing too. That's just wonderful. And I'm curious because as I was thinking about those two genres, though, I was thinking the one thing about a recipe is you need testers, right? So to know that this is even going to come out, or at least it needs to come out it needs to come out a couple times, sort of the same, right? And I'm curious if I don't know, I was just thinking about that with poetry. Do you have testers? Do you think about it that way? I think that's an interesting kind of thing if we think of or do you also, on the other hand, do you think with your recipes, I don't want to have the testers that much. I don't want the testers. I don't know. I just was thinking about that sort of the difference in those genres.
Yes. Well, with the writing, the tester is your readers, right? Not your public readers, but the people you have gone to again and again with your work in progress, for them to pinpoint, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are, what you need to do more of, and less of. So I think that would be the recipe testing of the writing world. And I think, there are a couple of recipes in this book, but one thing we haven't talked about, which is hilarious, is that this is also a book about poetry. We've kind of just gotten so excited about the food that we've left that out. But I think if I were to publish recipes more than just one or two here and there, yes, I would want them to be tested. And I would want them to be tested by people who aren't me, because I can't see where I've forgotten to say something, right? You know those community cookbooks that are bound with those plastic things, and the recipe says something like, mix all ingredients, put in oven, and bake until done. And they know what to do. But they didn't send it to anybody else to see if those instructions worked. So yeah, and I like that there's a parallel between the writing process and the recipe writing process, which is more, I think, material, right, than the revising of a poem.
We have time for just one more question.
I actually wanted to follow up on Amy's question because I think there is a similarity between a poem and a recipe, particularly for you in terms of your love of form. And thinking about the recipe, there is room there for some experimentation, even the first time one does something, because one thinks, oh, you want dill, but I don't have any dill, and I really prefer my fresh basil anyway. Okay. But then you have to make a note, do I want to do that next time? But I just wonder if you could compare it or maybe talk about the joy of form, because as you know, you helped me just get into it, and I just thought, this is so much fun. I mean, give me a sestina, but also you helped me with the sestina because it's not just repeated words in the same way. I mean, they alter their meaning or you fiddle with them a little bit, so could you maybe talk about kind of variation and the imaginativeness of working with form?
Yes, but, well, I think of form as a guide, that it helps you narrow down the choices. There's something about that blank page that's so daunting, whatever you're trying to write. Just having a full range of possibilities can be too much. Even if you can get started, I think sometimes you'll find, which word do I use? Like the word for a color, and then there's so many words that might describe a single color. But if it has to rhyme with petunia, then you've already eliminated most of the possibilities. So I think it's really helpful, and it's freeing. Another way in which it's freeing, even though it can be difficult, is that it can turn writing a poem into something more like a math problem. And I found this as a teacher, that many students come in thinking of poetry as difficult. And if I don't give a very specific prompt, sometimes students feel lost. But if I give a formal prompt, especially one of those super annoying forms like the pantoum or the villanelle, where you don't have a lot of choice, some students love that, because all of a sudden, instead of having to distill the truth of the universe, they just have to find a way to make this thing make sense. So that's form. And maybe recipe writing, yes, there's a form to how you write a recipe. I think there's also a form to how you compose a meal, and maybe a form to how you use the products of a season. So, yes, the family silver, yes. So.
Can we give Adrienne and Siobhan one more round of applause?